Order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Good morning. Welcome to today's hearing, Advancing the Next Generation of Solar and Wind Energy Technologies. I want to thank our panel of witnesses for being here today. We're waiting on one more who is on his way in. Very excited to hear your perspectives on the importance of federal support for this crucial technology and what our next steps need to be. Solar and wind energy, we all know, reduce air pollution, support thousands of American jobs, and can reduce energy costs to our constituents across the country, which is very important. The solar and wind industries have grown tremendously over the past 10 years, and the prices for their power have fallen. I have numbers here that show the price of wind energy having fallen 69% and the price of solar falling 88%. These technologies are now forms of energy that are in the mainstream, providing cleaner air, creating a new green-collar sector, and lowering our utility bills. We believe that the solar and wind energy combined industries now employ over 350,000 Americans. These industries, like many, are a success story when it comes to talking about federal research and development. The Department of Energy established the Solar Energy Research Institute back in 1977, which later expanded and became NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. NREL set many of the early records for solar photovoltaic panel efficiency, and they demonstrated some of the first concentrated solar power projects. They also housed the National Wind Technology Center, and they've led offshore wind energy demonstration projects across the U.S. Despite these advances, we still need some serious technological leaps in order to grow at a significant scale. Even after all this work, in 2018, solar and wind energy together combined to produce just 8.2% of our electricity in the United States. It also appears that U.S. emissions increased from 2017 to 2018, and so we have some serious work to do. I also think it's important to acknowledge that this discussion is not being had inside a vacuum or only within the boundaries of the United States. China understands very well the importance of developing and deploying these technologies. As of today, it's hard not to say that they're the clear leader in clean energy investment, with over $100 billion invested in this space in 2018 alone. The United States was second, but we were $35 billion behind China. We should close this gap. I believe that our money is better spent here and that we have the talent and technology and pipeline to do this. But this is going to be a market in the 21st century. There will be many more jobs at stake. There will be many more technologies at stake, and I want all of those to be created here. I'm looking forward then to using this hearing to learn a little bit more about the opportunities that are in front of us, to make sure that we spend federal research dollars productively and smartly to have the best result for our constituents. Thank you again for appearing before me, and with that, I would like to recognize my colleague, Mr. Weber, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Lamb, for holding today's subcommittee hearing. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses. Mr. Stein, we're glad you could join us about the value of the state of solar and wind technologies in the U.S. and about DOE's clean energy research, development, demonstration, and commercialization activities in these areas. Solar and Wind RD is funded through the Department's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, or EERE. After substantial growth during the Obama administration, EERE is by far the largest applied research program. At almost $2.4 billion with a B dollars in annual funding, EERE is bigger today than the funding provided for research in fossil energy, nuclear energy, electricity, and cybersecurity combined. The research programs for solar and wind also expanded during this unprecedented growth in spending. So I'm a little surprised to see my colleagues on the other side of the aisle propose legislation to grow these offices even more, with an almost 60% increase in spending for wind R&D and almost 30% increase in solar R&D. Now, I want to be clear. I'm very supportive of DOE funding for innovative research in new solar and new wind technologies. Most of you will know Texas is a leader in wind energy. I'm also supportive of the kind of basic research like advanced computing, machine learning, and advanced manufacturing, and the development of new materials that benefits not just solar and wind, but all forms of energy technologies. But we need to take a responsible and balanced approach to energy research and ensure that federal investments go towards work that truly could not be accomplished by the private sector. Let me add, in the private sector, business is booming for wind and solar. Did I mention Texas is a leader in that? Last year, American renewable energy produced a record 742 million megawatt hours of electricity. Now, Mr. Chairman, you said that it was 8.2%. Our stats show 18% of the U.S. electricity generation. Maybe we need to add those two, get 26, divide by 2, and we get 13% of the electricity generation, and double its production, by the way, from a decade ago. Great progress is being made. This significant increase is almost entirely due to the incorporation of additional wind and solar power. Today, we're going to hear good news from our friends in these thriving industries that there are over 500 American factories building wind turbine parts, that a record 114,000 Americans have jobs supporting the wind industry, and that there are currently 250,000 Americans working in the $17 billion solar industry. It is abundantly clear that consumer demand is already driving increased deployment of these technologies. After all, this is what the industry is good at. But the private sector cannot conduct the fundamental research that lays the foundation for the next generation and the next technological breakthrough. That means focusing our federal programs on innovative technologies that are not already commercially deployed. For example, at the Center for Next Generation of Materials Design, led by National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, researchers work on advancing computational materials designed to discover new, novel materials. By pursuing this breakthrough through science in materials, we can fundamentally improve the performance of solar energy technologies. With our national debt at over $20 trillion and rising, and mandatory spending caps guiding budgets on everything from energy to national defense, we simply cannot afford to increase the spending in every program. So we need to focus our efforts on truly groundbreaking research. Let us not duplicate the efforts of American industry. By prioritizing fundamental research with broad application to all forms of energy, we can enable the private sector to build innovative market, reduce energy cost, and grow the American technology. And Mr. Chairman, one more time, thank you. I'm going to yield back. Appreciate you doing this.
Thank you. And the chair now recognizes Chairwoman Johnson for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this timely hearing. The two most valuable renewable energy resources, solar energy and wind energy, is very important. Over the past 10 years, cost of both wind and solar energy have decreased dramatically, making them a vital part of the energy mix of the United States. According to a recent report from Austin-based analysis firm TXP Solar and Energy, saved Texans $5.7 billion in electricity costs from 2010 to 2017, compared to what they would have paid if these renewable energy sources were not part of the energy portfolio. And I might say the other energy is the highest in the nation, even though we are all producing fossil fuel state. I am proud to say that Texas now leads the United States in installed energy capacity, with over 24 gigawatts of wind energy. That's enough energy to power over 7 million homes. The wind energy industry also brings tens of thousands of jobs to the state, including jobs at several manufacturing facilities that support the wind industry by making products like blades, towers, and turbine housing that China is trying to take away from us. All that being said, we still have a significant investments we need to make to continue to innovate on these technologies, further bringing down their cost and making these technologies even more beneficial for Americans. In the wind industry, for example, we're exploring new technologies like offshore wind, which has significant potential for leveraging untapped energy resources near our coastal communities, and needs important R&D investments to help bring down the cost. In the solar industry, we are continuing to explore new types of solar cells made of advanced materials with record-setting efficiencies at affordable prices. We really can make investments that are both good and for the environment and the economy. That's why I'm looking forward to hearing from the distinguished witnesses assembled here today to learn how we can support innovation in the solar and wind industries, ensuring that these important energy resources can play an even larger role in our clean energy future. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I now recognize Ranking Member Lucas for an opening statement. Okay, thank you. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. This time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. First, Dr. Peter Green is Deputy Laboratory Director and Science and Technology Officer for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. He's responsible for developing NREL's research goals and strengthening its core capabilities, including the lab's solar and wind energy technology activities. Before his current position, he was director of DOE's Energy Frontier Research Center for Solar and Thermal Energy Conversion and a scientist at Sandia National Lab researching polymers, glass, and electric ceramics. Ms. Abby Hopper, Esquire, is president and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association. Before leading SEIA, she was director for the Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and previous to that, director of the Maryland Energy Administration. Mr. Kenny Stein, Esquire, is Director of Policy at the Institute for Energy Research. He's previously held positions for Senator Ted Cruz, including Legislative Counsel covering energy, environment, and ag issues, and served as policy advisor for the Cruz presidential campaign. Finally, we have Mr. Tom Kiernan, who's President and CEO of the American Wind Energy Association. Prior to joining AWEA, he was the president of the National Parks Conservative Association for 15 years and served various roles at the EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. As our witnesses should know, you will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in its entirety in the record of the hearing, and when you have all finished speaking, we will begin with questions. Each member will then have 5 minutes to question the panel. We will start with Dr. Green.
Good morning. Chairman Johnson, Chairman Lamb, Ranking Member Weber, Ranking Member Lucas. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to discuss the future research prospects of wind and solar energy and the opportunities they provide for advanced technologies. I'm Peter Green, as introduced. I'm the Deputy Lab Director for NREL. Prior to coming to NREL, I spent 10 years on the faculty University of Texas, another 10 years in the faculty University of Michigan. Prior to that, I was at Sandia National Laboratories. NREL, for the last 4 decades since its inception, has made critical contributions that underpin the science and the technology innovation that have led to establishing the now viable wind and solar industries. Indeed, as Chairman Lamb pointed out, the last few years we've seen a rapid expansion of both solar and wind capacity of power generation. He also correctly points out that these industries employ over 350,000 people, and together they provide about 8.2% of total electricity. Now, one of the primary reasons has to do with a drop in price and cost, and the cost is now on parity with conventional energy production sources, in some cases a little better. I want to emphasize, however, that this is just the beginning. A number of scenarios that people have evaluated will project that conservatively we need to increase power from both wind and solar by at least an order of magnitude over the next decade. And it's going to have to come down to much lower prices, in fact, a half where they are at this point. And so that really sets a bar for where we really need to be. So we're not currently able to do that. And perhaps one thing to point out, if you look at solar energy, and the goals, the R&D goals here are really set by the manufacturers, the plant developers, and utilities. And so if you're going to increase this more than order of magnitude capacity and lower prices, there's a lot to be done. There is a myriad of solar PV technologies which require significant more research. Some of which, the multi-junction, the tandem cells, are quite effective in terms of efficiency. The perovskites, which can be produced roll-to-roll, could be a game changer, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done on stability, a lot of more research to be done. Solar power, concentrating solar power is another area where, in fact, the goal is for 5 cents per kilowatt hour, but at the same time, combined with thermal storage, which is cheaper than batteries, provides significant opportunities. There's a lot of work going on there in China right now, but not so much in this country. I want to say something about wind power. With regard to wind power, the idea is that you like to be able to produce wind from anywhere within the US, onshore, offshore, together to east or west coast, as well as the Great Lakes. You also want to do it at half the current cost. Now, there's a challenge. The International Energy Agency got together, the best researchers around, to actually put together what the future of wind should look like. And it's an interesting quote from the report. It's a realizing the full potential of wind technology will require a paradigm shift in how wind turbines and power plants are designed. Really what's happened here is that these the new wind machines are going to be full length, about almost 250 meters high. It's higher than the Washington Monument. There's some challenges. One, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take advantage of the wind resource, which is much more rich at that level. However, with these new huge wind machines, they're going to have to be lighter, and they're going to have to be cheaper. So that's a major challenge in itself. We don't understand the wind resource in enough detail at that level. That's also going to require more research. The blades are going to be too long, so you can't transport them along the highway, so they're going to have to be on-site manufacturing, taking advantage of new manufacturing technologies. That's another challenge. Recycling is another issue. And even more importantly, the current wind farms underperform. And so there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done to understand the wind dynamics and things to be able to optimize the performance of the farms by and large. So these are new areas here. So I have 2 final comments to make. The current grid modernization efforts, as well as the complementary technologies like storage, these are continuing. And certainly they're going to be able to facilitate large amounts of renewable energy in the grid. And the final point that I really want to make, 2 final points. NREL has spent a lot of years going from basic science towards implementation and in terms of commercial interactions. And so this has been part of our DNA since our inception in 1977. This new system, interactive system that DOE has really fostered, where you've got interactions between academia, national labs, and industry, has worked well. The different funding models have worked well. They're responsible for where we are at this point with wind and solar. And I think that this will be quite useful in the years to come. We cannot reach those goals without further R&D spending. And again, let me thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Green. Ms. Hopper.
Great. Good morning, Chairman Lamb, Ranking Member Weber, and Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to be here. My name is Abby Hopper. I am the CEO and president of the Solar Energy Industries Association, or SEIA. I think everyone here has a great acronym. That's mine. SEIA, and we are the National Trade Association for the American Solar Energy Industry. We have about 1,000 member companies in every state across the nation. And as you've heard, and as we never get tired of telling you, we have about 250,000 Americans working in our industry. It is a $17 billion a year industry. There is bipartisan support for solar industry with policymakers in both parties at both the federal, the regional, the local, the state level, every level of government, advancing this clean, competitive, job-creating energy source. The modern solar industry has benefited tremendously from technology that the Department of Energy has helped bring to market. This has included solar plus storage, which has achieved higher asset utilization, smart inverters for flexible power control, better communications and data analytics, and improved codes and standards. And so SEIA supports the committee's draft bill to authorize and fund solar research. So allow me to share our industry's vision with you and explain why continued investment by the federal government in research and development is critical to making that vision a reality. As you've heard lots of statistics, my particular solar one is that solar now currently represents about 2.3% of U.S. electricity generation today. We have established an aggressive goal for ourselves to make solar account for 20% of all U.S. electricity generation by 2030, thereby making the 2020s the solar plus decade. And we'll talk a little bit about why that plus is there. To get there, we're going to need to install an average of 39 gigawatts each year through the 2020s, including 77 gigawatts in 2030 alone. We'll need an average annual growth rate of 18% and cost reductions, as the good doctor said, across all market segments by nearly 50%. So if we achieve this growth together, we'll build more systems annually than we have built to date. There will be 600,000 solar jobs in 2030, and that's more workers than every single U.S. company except for Walmart, more than the utility industry, and more than the mining and oil and gas extraction industries combined. So that level of employment growth will mean not just a larger, but a more diverse workforce, which will benefit from federal job training support. We must ensure that people of all backgrounds, genders, and abilities have access to both solar energy jobs and to the solar energy itself. If we achieve our 20% goal by 2030, our industry will add more than $345 billion into the U.S. economy. So while there are many notable areas for further research, to reach this 20% solar by 2030, I'd like to highlight a couple of areas that we think are critically important. First, soft costs, those non-hardware costs of permitting, inspection, interconnection, customer acquisition, and labor are increasingly representing a larger share of the cost of solar energy system. More efficient permitting can save consumers about $1 per watt, or roughly 40%, on the cost of a residential energy system. This includes direct costs such as fees and indirect costs such as time spent on applications and inspections. These issues will impact both established and emerging markets alike. Second, easing grid integration should continue to be a top priority. The grid must be able to handle this intermittent and variable generation, and investing in infrastructure upgrades are necessary to hit these targets. We also have to invest in cybersecurity technologies for photovoltaic and other grid interactive systems today that will ensure that as more of these come online, that we can recover faster and our systems are more secure. Third, we are supportive of efforts to advance U.S. solar manufacturing. The U.S. has the best national labs in the world, and I'm not just saying that because Dr. Green's sitting next to me, I do believe that. Leveraging these resources is essential to improving the competitiveness of U.S. solar manufacturers and the long-term health of the U.S. solar industry. And lastly, and importantly, we must fund late-stage technologies and field demonstrations. As just one example, energy storage will be a vital part of achieving 20% solar by 2030, but few utilities will incorporate large volumes of storage unless they understand how those systems will interact with each other. So thank you for your time and your continued support of the solar industry. The vision I have outlined is bold, but certainly achievable. We're working to overcome the challenges we must face to make the 2020s the solar plus decade, but we cannot do it alone. Research and collaboration with the federal government will be key to our success, and that means strong authorization language and funding to make sure it happens. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Hopper. Mr. Stein.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to participate in the subcommittee hearing on the federal government involvement in solar and wind energy research. My name is Kenny Stein. I'm the policy director for the Institute for Energy Research. We're a free market organization that conducts research and analysis on the functions, operations, and government regulation of global energy markets. The purpose of the federal government funding for research in any industry should be limited and clearly defined. The justification for such funding is that research in emerging or novel technologies would not otherwise be provided by private interests, whether companies or individuals. This is a reasonable role for the government to play. However, this can't be a license to spend money. Federal support should not go to projects that private interests already have a clear incentive to develop. Far too often, it's the case that the federal government provides grant money to companies to subsidize activities that they would already be undertaking. The content of the discussion drafts for this hearing slips into precisely this error. Wind and solar generation are widespread and well understood. Utilities and independent generators across the country have announced large targets for investments in increasing wind and solar installations, some of which were mentioned by the previous witness. This action is being taken in response to regulatory and consumer demand. This investment record doesn't suggest a shortage of private sector funding or commitment to wind and solar generation. The companies making these investments already have market and regulatory incentives to, quote, increase efficiency, reliability, security, and capacity of wind and solar generation, which is just quoting the first mission bullet of the discussion draft. Both the wind and solar industries are mature industries with plenty of private sector interest and investment in innovation and deployment. We're not talking about nascent or speculative industry. The need for federal funding at all is pretty debatable, to put it mildly. If federal money is still required at this point, the question must be asked, is there ever going to be a point where enough is enough? Given the already high rate of wind and solar investment, it's hard to see how more federal invention could possibly be beneficial. In fact, a heavier federal hand could end up limiting growth and innovation. The federal government, slow and process constrained as it is, cannot adjust rapidly to technological developments. As new operating processes or products enter the market, it can be left funding old or obsolete initiatives. Indeed, federal interference of the sort envisioned by these discussion drafts can actually lead an industry to spend its time trying to meet federal benchmarks for grants rather than asking the question whether an alternative might make more sense, which could ironically actually limit innovation. The best example of an appropriate role for the federal research funding can be found in the earliest days of solar energy generation. Early solar panels with poor efficiency found little uptake for terrestrial resource uses. However, the burgeoning space program identified solar as a potential energy source for spacecraft. Government funding from NASA then helped develop solar technology to the point where it is usable in space applications. And then years later, solar companies built on that foundation to develop the generation technologies that are now being applied to terrestrial electricity generation. The lesson here is that the federal government didn't choose a solar technology and then try to commercialize it or reduce its costs. The basic technology was developed for a specific national purpose, with private innovation later finding applications for the private market. This is how the process should work. The federal government does not have the characteristics or competency to be a startup accelerator, but it can effectively provide a base level of data and information for private innovators to build on. Thus, a better path forward for federal research spending would be focusing on the original mission that I suggested above, funding emerging or novel technologies and applications not otherwise supported by private interests. One example of this kind of focus is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory research into the use of perovskite material, as mentioned earlier, in solar cells. This is the kind of basic research that the federal government should be funding, leaving private entities to determine the most useful applications of these discoveries. There is a legitimate federal role in supporting such basic research that has the potential to improve the overall well-being of the American people or is required to meet a specific federal need. Note that this is not just a branding exercise with anything called early stage or basic becoming eligible for funding. Federal research spending should focus on truly novel technologies or applications. Further, this should not just be a license to spend more money. Clearly, focusing federal priorities means discarding some spending areas sometimes to hone in on research at, for example, the national labs or universities, a case where less can actually be more effective. The premise underlying these discussion drafts, then, in my opinion, is unsound. Mature industries like the wind and solar generation sectors with extensive and dynamic economic activity are not in need of federal interference, however well-intentioned. While basic research is a reasonable federal role, responsibility for later phases of the business cycle, such as commercialization or deployment, is best left in the hands of the industry itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. Mr. Kiernan.
Chairman Lamb, Ranking Member Weber, members of the committee, Ranking Member Lucas, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify again. Tom Kiernan, CEO of the American Wind Energy Association, representing approximately 1,000 member companies of AWEA, everything from the turbine manufacturers, the supply chain, the developers of the wind farms, the owner-operators, the researchers, consultants, et cetera. Wind energy is an American success story. We are currently providing, as was mentioned, 114,000 jobs, and we are either the #1 or the #2 fastest growing profession, the wind turbine technician, the fastest growing profession in the country. I'll point out, my colleague Abby Hopper often mentions the solar technician is either the first or second. We kind of go back and forth. An important point to note. Wind energy is also playing a key role in lowering the cost of electricity to consumers. Per third-party analysts, wind energy is the cheapest source, unsubsidized, of new electricity on the grid, and in many parts of the country, actually we're cheaper than the marginal cost of existing power grids. We're also, speaking of rural America, we are also providing $1 billion annually to rural America, whether it's through state and local taxes or land lease payments to farmers. Another observation. I think it was mentioned, we are operating in all 50 states, 500 manufacturing facilities, or having wind farms in those 500 different manufacturing facilities. And we are in 69% of all congressional districts, either manufacturing facility or a wind farm. And lastly, we are reliably on the grid. 6 states currently produce at least 20% of all their electricity from wind energy. And there are periods of time in some states where we're at 50, 60, or 65% of the electricity in that state for a period of time is reliably provided by wind energy. And then there's the offshore wind energy industry that is blossoming right now with another 8 to 10 gigawatts of wind energy offshore in the next decade. I'd like to now talk about the really important role of DOE's Wind Energy Technology Office in this American success story. They have been key in the R&D side of it, the innovation and the collaboration, especially on onshore, examples being they have helped us advance wind turbine technology. They have helped the industry overcome market barriers to increase the output of individual turbines and wind farms, to improve the reliability that I mentioned earlier, and to help reduce the costs, all for the onshore side. For offshore wind energy as well, they've been helping us drive down the costs of offshore wind, addressing installation challenges, helping to mitigate the environmental challenges, helping us with grid interconnection and integration and working supply chain. Now, I'd like to also importantly talk about the role of DOE in early, mid-stage, and late-stage research because of the unique capabilities that DOE has and the unique role that DOE can play. And let me give 3 different examples. First, DOE has data sets. They've got modeling capabilities, and they have supercomputing capabilities that industry simply does not have. With those types of assets, they have been quite helpful in having us optimize turbine designs. They've been quite helpful in coming up with algorithms for laying out wind farms to optimize the amount of energy you get out of a single wind farm. And they've also been quite helpful using the supercomputing capabilities to come up with operational algorithms, again, to optimize the output of a wind farm. These are activities the industry simply cannot do because we simply do not have those supercomputers, the modeling capabilities, and the data sets that DOE uniquely does have. Another role that they can play because of their unique capabilities is as a convener of collaborative efforts. So one example is they have been quite helpful with wildlife detection and deterrence technologies that because of their colleagues over in the Fish and Wildlife Service care deeply about the impact on wildlife, DOE can play an important convener role that has a credibility back with their colleagues at the Fish and Wildlife Service. They've been helpful there. They've been helpful convening efforts for hardware and software capabilities to mitigate the impact on radar that the Department of Defense cares deeply about, or that the Weather Service cares deeply about. So here again, DOE has played a convener and a collaborative role that uniquely DOE can play. And lastly, they've been very effective in third-party research that state and local regulators have appreciated. Lastly, they've also worked well with their colleagues on transmission and grid interconnection. So in closing, we fully support the role of DOE and appreciate the opportunity to testify today and look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, sir. We will now begin with questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Kiernan, I was wondering if you could expound a little bit on the supercomputing and algorithmic side of what DOE brings to the table. Do you see that as leading to an achievable gain or accomplishment within the next 5 or 10 years? And I ask that because in my own part of the country, we have DOE's main fossil lab there, and they're doing a lot on supercomputing and trying to optimize materials, liquid flows when it comes to hydraulic fracturing and natural gas and that kind of thing. And I would imagine it's the same out at NREL and other places. And it just sort of seems like we're in this era where a big jump in computing or an algorithmic advance can be applied to existing technology to achieve a lot of efficiency. Is that what you're hoping for, or is that what you're seeing, the potential for that?
Yes, we have seen it and are looking for more assistance, and I'm sure Dr. Green can also mention it, but a couple of examples that you've got the individual turbine, but because of DOE's modeling and supercomputing capabilities, understanding the airflow through one turbine and its impact on subsequent turbines in a wind farm is extraordinarily complex. And because of their capability, they've been able to say, hey, actually there are times when you want to let some of the wind slip past that first turbine to maximize output from the second and third level turbines, and that in total, the wind farm is, if you think about it as an entire system, is able to increase the output at no additional cost. It's just more intelligently managing individual wind turbines so that the total farm does better. Their Atmosphere to Electrons program and other similar programs at DOE have helped us optimize that management, and yes, we're looking for additional guidance and algorithms to do more so in the future.
And you believe that some of those advances were actually due to the hardware of the supercomputer that we have at DOE that is not commercially available?
That's my understanding, that their capability and their modeling has played a key role in that advancement for the industry.
Thank you. Ms. Hopper, did you have anything to add there as it applies to solar?
So I was shaking my head on the placement of wind turbines because, as you mentioned, I'm very familiar with offshore wind as well. So I appreciate the work that's happened on the wind side. On the solar side, I think there have been similar kind of advances in terms of using that the ability of DOE to, for us, it's sort of how you lay out systems and sort of what the efficiency of those systems are. All land is not the same, all roofs are not the same, and so how do we make it the most efficient? And the national labs have a unique capability that does not exist in the private sector to do that analysis.
Okay. Dr. Green, did you see that in your time at Sandia, where did you ever encounter some of those supercomputing resources being useful to your work?
Yes, absolutely. The national labs have enormous high-performance computing capabilities, Sandia, Oak Ridge, and certainly NREL in energy space. And everything they've said is actually quite accurate. We do rely on these kinds of models for guidance.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that to me it's an important point because, again, we're doing this in the face of very intense international competition, and we have a ticking clock when it comes to the environment. At least we believe that we only have a certain period of time to solve this problem of climate change. So I think putting these resources from the government and private sector together rather than sort of pitting them against each other might help us within that time frame. Mr. Kiernan, I noticed in your written testimony you talked about the wind energy industry hiring veterans at a much higher rate than the national average. Are you aware of specific programs that have helped produce that result, or are they just more naturally drawn to the industry? What have you seen?
It's a combination of factors. In some cases, it's an individual company that, yes, has an effort to outreach to veteran communities through veteran organizations. I think there's also an inherent connection. The men and women that are vets that have the skills to be outside problem solving, addressing some key challenges on their own or in teams are often attracted to and extraordinary employees, whether it's up tower and a turbine addressing some of the electrical or engineering issues. So it's a great fit. They also, frankly, the transition from the mission of serving the country to the mission of serving the country through wind energy is an obvious connection. So it's something that we are encouraging and exploring on how to build some further initiatives industry-wide.
Thank you for those efforts. I'm out of time, and I recognize Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Green, I really appreciate your testimony on innovative research taking place at NREL, particularly in the areas that could be game changers for renewable energy technologies like advanced computing, the chairman mentioned, and materials development. But when you look at the budget and compare EERE and NREL, our lead renewable energy lab received $315 million at FY 2019, or about only 13% of EERE's budget. In contrast, DOE's nuclear energy lab, Idaho National Lab, received $924 million, or 69% of the Office of Nuclear Energy's total. If your lab received a larger percentage of EERE's total budget, which, as we've noted, is by far the largest of the applied energy programs at DOE, What other types of innovative research could you undertake? Are there currently any areas of fundamental or early stage? You've been chatting with the chairman about that. Elaborate some more on that for us. What are some things you could do? I'll give you more time on that, but you can't due to funding restraints right now.
I would say currently the examples that I gave in terms of for solar, the more forward-looking research and looking at the more advanced technologies to understand how to improve the efficiencies and the performance. That's one area. The science of reliability, when you have these modules out there for years to understand, to predict how they're going to perform, that's going to be important.
Are you able to model the wind blade difference
Yes,
variation?
we absolutely can do that. We're able to model and visualize, and these kinds of calculations provide guidance for experimentalists to work on. With regard to wind, those new channels are daunting because, as I pointed out, you're looking at towers and the entire span going 250 meters. We need to understand the atmosphere and interactions with the atmosphere at that level. We don't at all. That's a major, highly collaborative program that we have to solve. Trying to optimize the wind farm performance is actually a grand challenge, as it turns out, and it's a grand computing challenge. And you're going to have to begin to validate what you predict as part of it.
Are you able to model that? Of course, Texas, on the west side of Texas, the western plains that we'd call, has a lot of wind farms out there.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Talk about off the coast as well. Are you able to model the difference between onshore turbines and offshore turbines?
So we're very good idea. Currently, most of the work's being done on onshore turbines, and we understand quite well. And this is a huge collaborative effort between us, Sandia, Oak Ridge, and all the national labs and academia. The offshore wind turbines, there's works beginning in that area. They present very different challenges. They're out there that tend on average to be larger. They tend to be floating and tethered by a range of things, and they experience much more extreme forms of weather and things like that. So there's a bit more work to be done.
Okay.
There's a lot more work to be done.
Well, let me do a follow-up to Mr. Stein over here. Mr. Stein, in your opinion, wouldn't it be better investment of tax dollars? I know I appreciate you taking a look at the draft legislation, but wouldn't it be better, in your opinion, investment of tax dollars to focus on the kind of fundamental research we see at the national labs instead of individual grants to companies?
Sure, I think that's the fundamental argument I was trying to make, and some of the things that were mentioned in Dr. Green's testimony sound like things like how to manufacture a wind blade that can be moved in pieces that can be moved on a road. That's a manufacturing challenge that's really the responsibility of the industry, rather than the government to come up with the technical corrections to be able to manufacture and install some of those things. So I think it's certainly some of the things that Dr. Green is talking about make perfect sense to be part of NREL's portfolio, but I think some of the
But be careful about where it goes,
Right.
because in the end, you mentioned it could wind up actually limiting what private companies are willing, ready to do.
If these companies end up trying to meet benchmarks for materials or wind turbine height or whatever that are set by the federal government, they focus on those benchmarks rather than thinking, is there a different way to do this? Is there a different location for this? Those sorts of things. That sort of innovation.
Right.
That,
Well, I appreciate that. And Ms. Hopper, I want to come over to you. As a former air conditioning contractor, I paid very close attention to the cost of energy and what air conditioners drew or the more efficient units didn't draw. You mentioned in your testimony that part of the problem was in the permitting and all of the things that went with getting lined up. You said, I think you said it could save as much as $1 per watt in soft costs. That's fairly high when you figure a light bulb is 100 watts, okay? So I think you might want to go back and look at that. It's maybe not as high as $1 a watt. A single light bulb, an incandescent light bulb, can be more, 40 watts, 75 watts, maybe $1 a kilowatt.
I will certainly go back and look at that, but
Yeah.
I'm fairly confident that that's the right number. But we'll go back and look at it, sir.
Okay, just curious. I appreciate you all, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Recognize Mr. Caston for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the panel, and I can assure you that I have sometimes paid $1 a watt in development costs. Those numbers are shocking and they are high. It's $1,000 a kilowatt. So to the panel, I would vouch on that. I want to talk a little bit about some cross-cutting energy technologies and specifically energy storage. The growing the capacity for storage on the grid is increasingly critical with the rise of intermittent resources and non-dispatchable resources, and is going to be a critical part of the way that we make sure that the lights stay on in the absence of deploying really inefficient fossil generation on the margin that's bad for the environment and bad for the economy. Dr. Green, in your testimony, you discussed the importance of developing diverse technology solutions for meeting our energy storage needs. Can you elaborate for us on why having a wide array of different energy storage technologies is important?
Yes, most certainly. So one of the characteristics of, say, wind and solar is because they're variable. And so, you don't have the sun at night. And so one of the things you like to be able to do is when you're generating an enormous amount of energy, you like to be able to store it and use it at a later time. That's one of the primary reasons. Mm-hmm. And there, in fact, are a number of modes of storage. Of course, lithium-ion batteries being the most common one, but certainly you've got pumped hydro, compressed air, and a range of other battery technologies out there that people are researching to do this.
Thank you. Ms. Hopper and Mr. Kiernan, in both of your testimonies, you indicated the need for R&D into later stage technologies and field demonstrations, including in grid storage. Can you talk a little bit about what specific support is needed for later stage demonstration projects?
Sure, I will share. I would echo Dr. Green's sentiment that sort of rapid deployment and broad deployment of storage is critical to reaching high penetration levels for renewables, as you know, Congressman. And so I think the most important thing for the demonstration project is to demonstrate to utilities, who are actually the ones who have to operate the grid, that this storage capacity can interact. It is operable. It can interact, and it certainly can interact at large scale, and that these intermittent resources, wind and solar being the two most important ones, can function and provide reliable power. So I think the federal government has a unique role to play in proving that out. One of the things we haven't really, we've sort of assumed but haven't said explicitly is that NREL and all of our national labs they are respected. They have a unique role in verifying sort of systems and verifying technologies that the private sector doesn't have. And so as we look to utilities to adopt these technologies, if they have been verified by an institution like NREL, they're going to have much broader adoption. Mr. Kiernan?
Two quick things to add. First, in looking at storage, agree it's important on the grid and that we need to look at multiple types of storage, not just batteries, but pump hydro, other technologies that allow you to store energy for long periods of time is very helpful for the grid. One point. Second is I would encourage the committee also to think about transmission. Transmission is critically important to enhancing the grid and to enabling more wind and solar from remote places where it's generated to have the transmission grid to move it to load. That's not storage, but you can think of it as storage in that you're bringing new energy from one distant place to load where it's needed when it's needed. So as you're looking at an infrastructure bill, potential bill, please look seriously at transmission and enhancing the grid through that.
Follow-up for both of you. I think all of us who've spent time in the energy development space are aware of this valley of death where the risk is still a little bit too high for the private sector, but it gets hard to push back on people who say government shouldn't be there anymore. Can you speak specifically to what you would like to see the national labs doing to help de-risk those storage technologies that are close but not quite to the point where the private sector's taken them up yet?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I think across sectors, people are very familiar with that valley of death. And as I think about solar companies and storage companies, there's about, we have about 10,000 solar companies specifically. About 3% of them have more than 500 employees. The vast majority of these are small businesses. So as they look at sort of their resources to commercialize some of these technologies, they just aren't there. So this thing is a false assumption to say that private sector will simply take over. So what do I think the national labs need to do? They need to move through that stage of development. They've done the basic research on sort of what the options are, and then do more research to work towards commercialization. And I think they are uniquely positioned to do that. It's not a place the private sector is going to take over. And I do believe it's for the public good. As we think about how we're transforming our electric grid and what we want that energy portfolio to look like, it is because it's going to benefit the American public, and so there's certainly a public interest in making that investment.
The only quick thing I would add, if I may, we are very, very early on in figuring out hybrid projects, projects that have wind and solar and storage as one that allows the developer to provide quite stable electricity to customers. There was a recent, one of the few examples, but Portland Gas and Electric provided by NextEra, and there's a whole lot of additional research that can be done, needs to be done to figure out how you create these hybrid wind, solar, storage combined projects to help the grid.
Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Recognize Mr. Biggs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the chairman and the ranking member for holding this hearing today. Thank each of the witnesses for being here. As I think some of you, particularly Ms. Hopper, noted, Arizona with regard to solar is highly developed, I guess I would say, compared to many of our friends, other states around the country. And people just naturally assume because Arizona gets 361 days of sunshine a year, we're going to be the leader. But we're not number one yet, but we certainly are making advances. But I wanted to talk a little bit, and listening to the testimony, I've enjoyed listening to each of you testify today. Dr. Green said at one point that wind farms are underperforming. I don't disagree, and my research kind of indicates that as well. And I appreciate Ms. Hopper talking about regulatory reform necessary, and that'll I'll roll that back into what I'm going to say in just a second. Then Mr. Kiernan talked about transmission and store, and all of you have talked about storage. Mr. Stein and others talked about storage. That is really critical if this is going to succeed in the long term. But I want to talk about something that's important to my home state with relationship to both solar and wind, and that is the notion of the necessity for critical minerals that go into the creation of whether it's solar panels or infrastructure and facilities for either types of solar or wind farms. So it is important that we streamline mineral development in the United States to sustain production and the infrastructure necessary to deliver energy, whether it's these green energy or traditional energy. Solar industries, for instance, are dependent on minerals including aluminum, cadmium, gallium, indium, iron, lead, nickel, silica, silver, tellurium, tin, zinc, and copper. And I bring up mining because over the last 20 years, the U.S. has doubled its import reliance to the point that we are now 100% dependent on foreign countries like China and Russia for 20 metals and minerals, many of which are essential for energy infrastructure, national security, and defense application. The President and his administration have published executive directives to begin important work on identifying immediate domestic sources for critical minerals, including the need for geophysical mapping of the United States to support management of private sector mineral exploration and to provide data for land use planning. Still, a lot of our friends on the other side of the aisle are pushing anti-mining legislation, including the friend of mine from Arizona who's the chairman of the National Resources Committee. That will crush the hard rock mining industry, impose punitive high royalties, a new dirt tax, and add more red tape to the permitting process. These minerals are critical to the future and of what you do and what you want to see happen. And just like you would like to see regulatory streamlining done in your particular fields, it seems to me that we should be looking at that with regard to mining. Right now we have a copper mine that has been waiting to go online for 15 years and has spent $2 billion and has not been able to turn a spade of dirt yet. $2 billion. So this is critical. And also we also need to recognize that there are potential environmental costs as well. Clearing land for solar energy infrastructure may have long-term effects on habitat for native plants and animals. Even in the pristine, secluded deserts of Arizona, where I'm seeing solar farms go in, there was a necessity for water as well, which is in the desert area can be very tough to get to. And in Arizona, only 4.6% of our source of energy comes from solar energy. but it is home to nuclear, 3 nuclear power reactors that produce almost 30% of Arizona's electricity while emitting no greenhouse gases. Additionally, the Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station is America's largest and employs more than 2,500 workers. The private sector, which is better equipped than the federal government to research and develop renewable energy technologies generally, is already leading the way in advancing solar and wind energy technologies. For instance, APS announced a major clean energy initiative, including new battery storage, which I think you've all talked about, and I think that's critical for the success of green energy in the future. And they intend to build additional new solar plants with storage that will deliver affordable energy to Arizonans. This initiative will add 850 megawatts of battery storage and more than 100 megawatts of new solar generation. And Secretary Perry called this a great example of an all-of-the-above approach to energy policy. In short, I think nuclear energy is also a reliable source of electricity in the United States. I appreciate each one of you and your work and your effort. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Horn, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here and for your testimony today. I live in a district, I'm from Oklahoma, I live in a district with a strong presence of hydrocarbon, natural gas, wind, and solar, so we have a lot of energy in Oklahoma, as you might imagine. And Mr. Kiernan, in your written testimony, you said that DOE modeling and analysis has been important in demonstrating how the increasing diversification of generating resources, natural gas, wind, solar, storage, all of the above, can be reliably integrated into the grid. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the importance of diversification of energy sources and what it looks like in terms of reliability and stabilization as we move forward?
Did you want that for Mr. Green or for me, Mr. Kiernan? Want to be?
Oh, Mr. Green, I'm sorry. Wrong person. You were nodding, and I'm Mr. Green. That's for you.
I think the diversification of the energy generation sources is actually very important. It's happening right now, particularly as we go through the energy transition, as we combine renewables with the conventional sources. There are lots of unknown questions, and one of the major activities in which NREL is currently engaged is trying to propose this new, what we call the Flatirons campus, where we're going to have megawatt-type solar arrays, wind, natural gas, a range of sources. And here we're going to begin to understand, essentially, how we can look at the performance of hybrid systems, for example, combined storage and energy generation. How would these perform in relation to generation from fossil or even from natural gas? This new campus has a series of assets, as I mentioned, that include solar and wind. We have high-speed connections to Idaho National Labs and nuclear. So this is going to be a unique facility which really will enable us to understand how the new grid of the future is going to operate at some level.
Thank you. And many of our energy companies now are finding innovative ways to reduce water usage, increase efficiency, and use technology to help get us to cleaner energy, reducing emissions. But we know that these transitions from our current systems to what comes next, from fossil fuels to natural gas to the next generation, is costly, and it takes time. And we've heard about ambitious timelines, which quite frankly I'm a little bit concerned about, given the cost and the where the technology is. So I think I want to be. My question is, how do we be realistic about this trade-off, what it's going to take to encourage this transition, to get there sustainably and in a way that doesn't hurt jobs in the process, but that sustains us, hurt jobs, raise costs to consumers in a sustainable way? And I'll leave that to if you want to take it, or if anybody else, whoever wants to take that one.
I'll give one answer and the others can join me. What's happening is that we're progressing in a natural way. We can define goals for the next few years in such a way that are quite sustainable. And that's really what's happening right now. And this is how we propose this will happen.
Sure, we'll share. So thank you for that question. I agree that ensuring that consumers have access to low-cost, reliable, affordable energy is critically important. And I think the only way that this transition will happen is if the the sectors that we represent, wind and solar, can offer that. And I think what we have talked about is that over the last decade, the cost of solar specifically, and Tom can talk about wind, have fallen dramatically so that we are the lowest cost option in many cases. And we talked about storage to provide that 24/7 reliability. And so I think that transition can happen and certainly will be enhanced by continued investment in R&D.
The only thing I would add, we support having multiple sources of generation on the grid. It is that diversity and the diversity of attributes and capabilities of wind versus solar versus gas versus nuke that enable a very stable grid, pulling those together. And what I know wind is looking for going forward is the ability, and we're talking to FERC and the RTOs about this, the ability to compete in providing both the electrons, but also the reliability services, voltage support, frequency support, that actually wind is uniquely capable of providing. We want a market out there so that we can compete in providing those services, and over time, different sources can take on greater amounts of work on the grid.
Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Babin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Stein, I love the example that you use of how government funding for NASA's solar space application led to the solar technologies that are now being applied to electricity generation. As the ranking member of the Space Subcommittee, I think that NASA is one of our most valuable research entities, so I want to thank you for recognizing that. But I think you're right when you say that we should only be funding research to create the foundation of new technologies, not using tax dollars for the whole life cycle of commercialization. Is there a different area of solar or wind, something revolutionary or market-changing, that would be a better recipient of our limited federal monies for research?
Well, one example, I mentioned it briefly, and Dr. Green also, I think, mentioned it, is research into perovskite materials in solar cells. These are new materials that aren't currently used in solar cells, and they have shown a lot of promise for being very efficient, using less resources per watt developed. So
yes.
I think that's a perfect example of, and that's something that NREL is already doing. But my point also is that once you've got that foundation, that discovery, the actual application, finding where it works best, what sort of applications, that's really should be the private sector role rather than NREL.
I got you. Another thing that I thought was intriguing when you said, and I agree with you, when you said that federal support should not go to projects that private interests have already got a clear incentive to develop. Can you give an example of a time that EERE or another program has used federal funds to develop something that very easily could have been done by the private sector with no cost to the American taxpayer, I might add? Supporters of the Green New Deal want us to completely cut the power on our current energy grid and transition to 100% renewables over the next several years, and I see that being detrimental to our economy. And can you explain how a more targeted plan to invest federal money in early-stage clean energy research followed by private sector development and deployment could better maintain our economic growth and lessen the burden of our working class? I know that was two questions that I asked. The first one, of course, answer the primary answer I wish you would give first.
Sure.
Okay.
Well, the famous example goes back to the stimulus and some of the money that was wasted on that. Obviously, Solyndra is the famous example,
right,
where you had a private company that already had a manufacturing technique that they were trying to develop, and the federal government basically wrote them a blank check. The problem is that they weren't really ready for prime time, and that's part of why we're struggling to get private funding in the private market. So I think that's an example of when you look at the SEIA. She earlier mentioned that it's a lot of these smaller businesses, that the solar industry, but the large utilities are also making these investments. There's other parts of the private sector that are making investments into rolling out. They've made a lot of commitments for certain percentages to come from renewables in the future, that sort of thing. And those are private sector commitments, and some of those are driven by state level governments. But the point being is that that's a private groundswell, both consumer demand and regulatory demand. Right. It's not the federal government setting those benchmarks and trying to force the private sector to meet them.
Okay, thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Foster, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Previous questions have emphasized the crucial nature of energy storage to high penetration of wind. And this is something I've agreed with for a long time, and it's one of the reasons I plan to reintroduce the BEST Act, the Better Energy Storage Technology Act, that expands grid storage R&D as well as demonstration projects. And it's also directs DOE to establish cost targets for energy storage, which I think are going to be crucial for just benchmarking progress. And so my question is, what do you see as the balance between R&D needed for energy storage and demonstration projects that would just, have utilities gain confidence that it works? Dr. Green?
Yes, I agree. There is significant research that needs to be done for energy storage. You just look at lithium-ion batteries, for example. One of the challenges, it has a cobalt, which is sort of had limited in supply. And the idea then is you're going to have to find new electrodes that perhaps are cobalt-free.
Sure, well, they're the JCs are programmed at Argonne.
As just one example.
Right.
There is research that needs to be done in a range of other battery chemistries. For example, sodium-ion batteries that perhaps even may be safe for long-term and sustainable.
No, in areas like pumped hydro, I've been really impressed at how mature that technology came almost immediately. I don't know, by 1920 or 30.
Right.
Essentially, everything had been already optimized.
I wouldn't say it's already optimized, but it's certainly the most commonly used one, but it's only available in certain parts of the country.
And so well, let's see, maybe I'll switch to Mr. Kiernan. You emphasize the importance of distribution network. And, there are many concepts for this. There's, I guess, high voltage DC overlays across the whole grid. More speculative things like superconducting power transmission lines, which are actually, I believe, now being deployed at some scale. And so, again, what is the mixture of effort that you think would be optimum here? Technology development, system modeling, in cases where things like high voltage DC lines, the main problem is NIMBY, that no one wants to see new high voltage lines, and so the best response there would be robotic underground installation to drop costs. Where do you see the best bang for the buck, both in R&D and demonstration?
Let me share a big picture. In agreement, there are multiple enhancements to the grid with transmission that we are looking for. Yes, long-distance DC lines would be helpful and cost-effective, I'll point out. As well, though, there are some shorter transmission lines that connect the seams on the grid. You have different grids throughout the country, and they don't often connect well between the different grids. So actually getting the different RTOs, the different grid operators, to plan together where they might collectively build transmission lines across these seams between the different grids is also a really important way to advance the grid. So we've been encouraging Congress, as you're looking at your infrastructure bill and potential transmission enhancements, guidance that you can give to FERC to encourage the RTOs to do simultaneous planning or planning together is one way. Also, different ways of giving FERC some type of backstop siting authority, limited, to encourage states to move the permitting process. Yes, permitting for transmission is difficult, and there need to be some incentives or encouragement, and Congress can be helpful there.
Yeah. No, the seams you referred to have to do with the phase slippage between different subgrids where you just can't connect them, or that would be presumably solved with a DC overlay?
In places that normally it's honestly just the seams between two different grids, and we just need more interconnects between the grids so they can move power. For example, up in Pacific Northwest, and then you've got California, they're doing some testing and some modeling right now of connecting those grids so that, for example, the Bonneville power and all the hydroelectricity can move down to California when they need it. And when you've got extra solar power down in California, it can get shipped up. That energy imbalance market that they're creating is proving very cost effective to consumers. So more transmission lines that connect the grid allow you to save money for consumers because you're getting excess power from one region, moving it to another when they need it, and vice versa.
So the difficulty is the energy imbalance rather than multi-cycles of phase slip are sort of a thing of the past, is what you're telling me.
It is the energy imbalance where we can, with limited transmission, solve or address the problem.
Thank you, and I'd be interested in specific research areas there that the government might consider investing in.
We can
Thanks
offer
much.
that.
My time's up, and yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Fletcher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lamb, and thank you, Ranking Member Weber, for holding this hearing today. Thank you to the witnesses for taking the time to testify. I am from Texas, where we believe in an all-of-the-above energy approach. And many people know, of course, of Texas's long history in producing our nation's energy. But many people are surprised to hear that Texas is the largest wind energy producer in the country. And that we are producing about 25 gigawatts of wind power, as the committee chairwoman noted in her comments this morning, and supporting nearly 25,000 jobs in wind energy in the state. We have 3 times more installed wind capacity than the second highest producing state. And in fact, there are only 4 countries in the world that produce more wind energy than Texas. Now, this wind energy surge was made possible after then Governor Rick Perry invested $7 billion for electrical transmission projects that connected West Texas, with its abundance of wind potential, to distant metropolitan areas like my own in Houston, which really is distant in Texas, as many of our panelists know with their connection there. So those new lines drew investments from industry into renewable energy and made us the leader that we are today. So in Texas, we believe that there is a mix. There is a mix of different energy sources that's important, and that we believe that the government has a role to play, that industry has a role to play, and that academics and research have an important role to play in bringing all of these things together. And that's what we want to do, is bring everybody together and look at what our energy future looks like. So I want to touch on a couple of follow-ups to some of the questions that were asked today. In particular, Ms. Hopper, Mr. Caston asked you some questions about storage, as did Mr. Foster, and I think storage really is the linchpin to providing reliable power in the solar and wind sectors. And so what I would love is kind of sitting here today from your perspective, do you have an estimate or a time frame on what we're looking at for when we will have that reliable power source and more storage? What are kind of the estimates on that right now?
Sure. Thank you for that question. And I just have to say, so Texas is the number 5 solar state in the country now, and we think it will be number 2 in the next 5 years. So I hope that you will consider broadening your perspective and thinking about Texas as not only a wind powerhouse, but soon to be a solar powerhouse as well.
Yes, and we do, and I did not mean to skip that. Certainly in Houston, we have many of those 10,000 jobs right in my backyard.
Absolutely. So Mr. Kiernan and I have the pleasure of having a good relationship with our colleague who's the head of the Energy Storage Association. Their goal is to have 35 gigawatts of storage deployed by 2025, so pretty short order. That level of deployment, I think, will be transformational in terms of providing reliable, so our power is reliable today, but in terms of what you're looking for, which is sort of that 24/7 product, I think it will be transformational in providing that. So that's certainly the goal that the storage industry is looking towards. As the Congressman said, sort of setting those benchmarks are important so that we can measure progress and we can direct our focus on our R&D investment to make that happen.
Great, thanks. And I have a follow-up question. One thing that we know as the energy capital of the world in Houston is that it is a global business. And one of my concerns, and I think you all know well, there's strong international competition to develop and commercialize solar and wind technologies, and it's often between the United States, European countries, and China. So could you explain how the DOE-led solar and wind energy R&D allows the United States to remain competitive and improve its economic competitiveness in these markets? Maybe Dr. Green, can you talk about that for us?
We have remained competitive, and with considered funding, we will continue to remain funded. The funding models where you have this interaction between academics, national labs, and industry is a very effective one. DOE has different, you look, for example, at the basic sciences, supported by BES in some areas, together with EERE, more to the applied end. These have been effective. If you look in terms of our scientific infrastructure as a nation, we still remain the leader. And our ability to advance renewable technologies is largely based on this very advanced scientific infrastructure here. And
Okay.
so, yeah.
Thank you. I want to get in one quick other question before my time expires. So maybe Ms. Hopper, could you briefly touch on related issues like the impact of tariffs on imported solar panels that may make it difficult for solar companies to invest in research, development, demonstration, and commercialization activities, even when they're facilitated by DOE?
Okay. So thank you for that question. Obviously, the impact of both the solar-specific tariffs as well as the pancake effect of the steel and aluminum tariffs and the other tariffs that have been imposed by this administration have proved very challenging to our industry. They are additional costs. They're additional tax to our consumers. And so that has made our product less competitive. The growth that we had anticipated over the last 2017, 2018 has been stalled. And so we have flatlined instead of grown, which has been frustrating. So if obviously, I think many of the research that our companies do in partnership with the federal government requires cost share, right? And so if you have less product, less demand for your product and less, it's more expensive, it's harder to invest in that R&D. And so that has been one of the sort of things we haven't talked about as much, but that's certainly been one of the impacts of tariffs, is that there is less opportunity for us to continue to invest in that R&D with the government.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence in letting me go over. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Ms. Stevens for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I represent a district in southeastern Michigan, the suburbs of Detroit, and Michigan has a robust wind and solar energy presence. I was very proud to lead a letter with about 100 of my colleagues signing on with Mr. Paul Tonko to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, encouraging the chairman to call for incentives for clean energy to be included in any tax infrastructure package that we put forward. We're also thrilled in Michigan that we have Utility Workers Union of America with 10,000 employees who are playing a leading role in this space. But what I'd like to hone in on today is something that Mr. Stein said and has in his testimony, in which he said that mature industries like the wind and solar generation sectors with extensive and dynamic economic activity are not in need of federal interference, however well-intentioned. Mr. Stein went on to say that while basic research is a reasonable federal role, responsibility for later phases of the business cycle, such as commercialization or deployment, are best left in the hands of the industry itself. Ms. Hopper, and in your testimony, you devoted significant time to addressing the soft costs through targeted research and programming. And Dr. Green, we're so proud of your work and what NREL represents and what you've been able to accomplish and achieve as a research institute. And what I'd like to do is just ask Ms. Hopper to hone in here so that we can be really clear about what we are talking about with the role of the federal government in commercialization of technologies where we need this convening power. So do you mind, Ms. Hopper, just chiming in a little bit about, without DOE's significant investments in solar energy technology research, where the industry would be?
So first of all, thank you for the question, and thank you for your leadership on the letter. I think it was a great message to send. So I'm happy to hone in on that. I think what I heard you asking me was sort of where would we be if not for the investments that had been made by the federal government? And I think if we look back to 2010, in 2010 we were at 0.1 gigawatts of solar deployed in the United States. At the end of this year, we'll have over 70 gigawatts. So that's a big increase. I don't know the percentage. It's a huge increase, right? 0.1 to over 70 gigawatts. And that happened because costs came down. And costs came down because there was investment by the federal government in that basic research, right? And figuring out what are the materials that work. There was investment in the commercialization, sort of how do we how do we take that basic research and make it so that it is commercially viable, right, at scale and at scope and at price? And then certainly, how do we bring people together to solve problems that are really too big for one company to solve? So as I think about that, I think about soft costs. Obviously, I talked about that. One company is not incented to figure out how the entire, every building inspector in the United States is going to more efficiently inspect solar systems on roofs. One company is not incented to figure out the best way to integrate these different resources, regardless of what kind of technology they are, into the grid. One company is not incented to figure out how do we solve cybersecurity? And we have all of these different ways that, different entry points into the grid, many more than we used to. So one company doesn't do that. And so I think our investment pays off in those situations, and storage we've talked about. And I think similarly, as we think about sort of the convening power and solving some of these big questions together, the federal government is uniquely positioned to do that. And so we would be, I think, I wouldn't be able to say 70 gigawatts. It would be a much, much smaller number at a much higher price.
Sure. Well, I'll also make note that we had a transition in the House of Representatives on January 3rd, and we have a new majority, and it's a robust majority, a lot on the docket, particularly in terms of restoring the faith and trust in government, the doing and delivery for our country. And I'm so thrilled to see that our Democratic majority is here today engaging in this discussion in a way that is quite meaningful to the charge of the time, which is how do we capture an economic opportunity as well as address the challenges around energy efficiency and climate change. So kudos to our chairman for bringing us here today. With remaining time, if we don't mind, I got one more specific question for Dr. Green. Airborne wind technologies, including those developed by a company that was previously supported by ARPA-E and now owned by Google, have a lot of immense potential, and they still appear kind of far from this commercialization space. Could you speak to NREL's work with airborne technologies and the potential obstacles and opportunities for further development?
We're not doing very much in the direction of airborne technologies. A lot of work is looking at land-based wind and offshore wind for the most part. At this point, we're not looking in great detail at the airborne technologies.
Okay. Does NREL need further support for commercialization activities if it's not in the airborne space, but in other spaces that pertains to wind and solar, or do you have what you need at this point?
No, I think what I articulated earlier in terms of the future of wind and the expansion in capacity as well over an order of magnitude from where it is today, there'll have to be enormous investment for us to get there.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I have gone over my time, but I would like to close by applauding Mr. Stein for his support of basic research and applauding our witnesses for their support of research, commercialization, and leadership in the space of wind and solar. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman. Good morning, and thank the witnesses for coming this morning. It's exciting. I developed wind energy technology for 20 years before coming to Congress. I love doing it. As we both know, or as we all know, the cost of wind and solar has decreased dramatically. The levelized cost of energy, 88% for solar and 69% for wind over the last decade. Now, you already got to answer that question, Ms. Hopper, so I'm going to ask Mr. Kiernan, what has driven the reduction in cost of solar, including basic research?
You mean for wind, sir?
Wind, yes.
A couple of factors. One, it has been the lengthening of the blades. Dr. Green referred to that. That is an important development. It allows us to capture more energy having longer blades, taller towers, and all the digitalization, computer application inside the turbine and the management of the entire wind farm. All of those have been kind of the primary drivers for the dramatic reduction in the cost of wind energy. And I will say, given research that's going on at DOE and in the industry, we are anticipating continued reduction in the cost of wind energy.
Well, I like hearing that. Ms. Hopper, where are the biggest costs in residential solar installations? Do you have a way to answer that?
Certainly. I would say the largest bucket of costs in residential solar installations are the soft costs. So those, as you know, the permitting, the inspections, and the time that it takes, we think that's about a third or so of the costs. And those bringing efficiency to that sector and sort of reliability and predictability to that, I think will cause great decrease in the cost of residential solar. And so if, federal assistance in streamlining that could be incredibly impactful.
So you've sort of already answered this question, but the trade wars that we're now engaging in, is that going to increase the cost to the residential solar customer?
Yeah, it's a good question. So just the solar specific tariffs that were imposed year one were 30% tariff. We're now in year two, so it's a 25% tariff. So that's an increase on the cost of the solar module, which is not the entirety of the project, but it is a significant portion, especially, it's different in each market segment, but it's significant regardless. And so yes, it has and will increase because one of the basic components has increased in cost.
What about cost on American jobs?
So as we looked, we do the Solar Foundation does a solar census every year, funded in part, I believe, by the Department of Energy. And that showed over the last, from 2017 to 2018, we lost about 8,000 jobs in the solar industry. Those are jobs actually lost. What it didn't capture, because it's hard to capture, are the jobs that were never created, right? So if you went back and looked at what our projections had been prior to the tariffs, we were on an upward trajectory that we flattened out and went down. And so I think there is another delta of opportunity not realized that's a little bit more difficult to capture.
Mr. Kiernan?
If I can jump in on the wind side, that absolutely the tariffs that are in place and being increased will increase the cost of wind energy in this country, harming consumers, increasing the cost of electricity to consumers because some of the important components we are importing and those tariffs are increasing the cost. We have submitted testimony, we can get it to you, testimony to the USTR about the particular number of jobs lost and increase in electricity costs to consumers and businesses as a result of these tariffs. It is deeply concerning to the industry.
Thank you. Mr. Green, Dr. Green, I did start my professional career at Sandia National Laboratories, but I spent many years at the National Wind Technology Center as well, and windy nights, shaking trailers and Chinook winds and so on. But somehow this administration budget has asked to expand the NWTC's office to better incorporate grid modernization research, including energy storage and diverse electricity generation sources. Why is the NWTC the right place for that?
It's the right place because right now it has some key assets. In addition to the wind machines, large megawatt solar arrays, it has electrolyzers, megawatt-sized electrolyzers. And in addition to that, it has connections to other energy assets, like high-speed connections to Idaho National Labs. It's going to be a place where people can begin to test and validate a range of new technologies. Hybrid technologies I mentioned earlier, storage and generation. It's going to be able to, for example, understand how the new grid is going to deal with faults that exist. Earlier we heard about trying to control the voltage and frequency of power going through a grid. This is the kind of place where you can begin to test new technologies to understand how they operate before you take them out to a field. It's going to enable the grid of the future. The grid of the future is going to be an autonomous grid. And the kinds of experiments that are going to be done, will be done at the Flatirons there, are going to be unique. There's no other facility in the world that can actually do what we're proposed to do. And so it is going to enable what was needed for the future in that sense.
Well, thank you. Hope to get out there to visit you guys.
I would certainly love to see you.
I yield back.
Thank you, and Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I thank you, Chairman Lamb, and Chairwoman Johnson for allowing me to wave on and for holding this important hearing on these draft bills. I'm sorry I have had to miss some of the discussion because we're across the hall with a hearing that I'm chairing. but I've introduced versions of the Wind Energy R&D Act since my freshman term, so I'll be focusing on the wind element of today's hearing. Sorry about that, Ms. Hopper, but during that time, the industry has grown significantly. Clearly, these are great opportunities for domestic wind, but we should not pretend that challenges do not still remain. So, Mr. Kiernan, what are some of the biggest barriers the industry faces to further deployment, and can DOE's Wind Office help lower those given barriers?
We perhaps refer to them as opportunities. We do see significant opportunities to continue reducing the cost, but we do need that primary and late-stage research, whether it's on transmission, as I've mentioned earlier, whether it's further digitization, improving the intelligence, if you will, of the management of a particular wind farm, integrating all of the different wind turbines on that wind farm, and better integrating wind onto the grid with solar, with storage, and I mentioned earlier about enhancing the transmission. Designing that grid of the future is a significant opportunity. It's needed, and we are looking to the research capabilities of DOE to lead in that effort.
Thank you. And in 2015, DOE updated its Wind Vision report, setting a target of 35% of U.S. electricity generation from wind power by 2050. We know that our nation has excellent wind resources, particularly from Texas to the Dakotas. But DOE and NREL also published a report called Enabling Wind Power Nationwide. This report found that taller towers, larger blades, and more efficient turbines can unlock wind's potential in many other regions, including the Southeast. So, Mr. Kiernan and Dr. Green, what are some of the challenges to developing taller and more efficient turbines, and can DOE research help?
DOE's research is helping. I'll yield to you, Dr. Green, in just a second. Thinking through both, as was mentioned earlier, the atmospheric issues at that higher elevation are extraordinarily complex. We don't have the modeling or the capability to do that. They do. Also, some of the logistics. A tall turbine is tough to get to that site. So thinking through those logistics, as equally complex is the longer blades, maybe having segmented blades. So these are challenges that we do look to assistance and leadership from DOE, given their unique capabilities industry does not have.
Thank you. Dr. Green?
Characterize it well. I would add one additional thing is that as you make these taller and taller towers, they're going to be limited by weight, and they're going to have to be cheaper. And so this means new materials and new processes, and that's where the new research is actually going to happen.
Thank you. And while some may suggest that wind energy is fully mature, I believe there are numerous ways in which there are still nascent aspects of the industry and substantial room for greater innovation. For example, there are emerging issues that must be addressed in order to unlock our nation's offshore wind potential, including floating platforms in the Pacific, which have not yet been commercialized, as well as distributed wind deployment. So, Mr. Kiernan, what are some of the ways that industry is hoping to continue to be able to be innovative and to improve technology development, reduce costs, and enhance grid integration?
Let me build off of your one example with which I agree, and that is for offshore wind, the floating turbines, which are to date viewed as notably more expensive, but a lot of people think that as we figure out that how to do the floating turbines and are able to standardize that process, they may end up actually less expensive than the current kind of monopile or attached to the seafloor bed, because we can take that to scale. So a good example, having the research for floating turbines may in the long run dramatically both reduce the cost and obviously enable offshore wind to be all over, whether East Coast, West Coast, wherever appropriately sited, and we don't have to be only in certain limited depths.
And do you believe that the Wind Vision targets are likely to be achieved without sustained federal RD&D investments?
We need DOE's additional funding to hit the Wind Vision targets. We were involved in the creation of Wind Vision, very much support that vision, do see it as a partnership. The industry is providing, obviously investing $12, $13 billion a year in this industry, and we look to the unique capabilities and roles that DOE can play to assist us, even though, yes, we're providing dramatic private investment, we need them as a partner.
Well, and thank you. And just to sum it up, does federal RD&D for wind energy support United States jobs, private investments, particularly in rural communities, and clean energy deployment?
We would not have the 114,000 jobs we have and the investment that we're doing annually of $1 billion a year in rural America were DOE not a partner with us through their R&D work.
Well, I thank you, and I yield back and hope that we can move a version of this bill, this Congress, and with that, I thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, before we bring the hearing to the close, I want to thank our witnesses again for testifying before us today. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from members and for any additional questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. The witnesses are now excused and the hearing is adjourned.